2006, a 16-year-old girl named Megan Meyer opened up a MySpace account. Who remembers that front end of the social media movement of MySpace? Who had a MySpace account? I think I had one for like 3.5 days before Facebook came along. Megan Meyer opened up a MySpace account in 2006. By September of that year, she had received an invitation from a young man named Josh Evans, who was about her age and who she thought, based on the pictures, was cute, seemed to be nice, and they began to communicate online through MySpace. That was in September. By October, she began to get some messages that were hurtful. Things like, "I have heard that you are mean to your friends, and I'm not really sure I want to communicate with you anymore." Several messages like that kind of climaxed in one that said from this Josh Evans, "Maybe it would be better if you weren't alive." Megan told her mom, Tina, about the messages, and they ended up in an argument because Megan had used some really colorful and foul language to respond to those messages. At the end of the argument, Megan went up to her room. 30 minutes later, she was found hanging in her closet, unresponsive. Authorities found her, tried to resuscitate her with no success. Megan Meyer died in late October 2006 as a result of those messages. A month later, after that happened, it was discovered that a woman named Lori Drew was actually Josh Evans. Lori Drew had found out that her daughter and Megan had been in an argument and were at odds and had had trouble with each other, so she opened this account thinking that she could push Megan away from these arguments, only to cause something incredibly horrible. Megan died. She battled depression. Her parents said that was something that she battled a lot in her life anyway. But at least in part, she died because of words. Written words, not verbally spoken audible words, but written words. But she died because of words, because of false words coming from a false source. False information drove this young lady to suicide. There can be a lot of discussion about whether any young lady should take words put across social media that seriously or not. Of course, I think we would all agree no. And yet, nevertheless, that's what happened. You know, false information, stories, rumors, gossip, it is amazing the damage they can cause. And those who are perpetuating the gossip or rumors can't possibly know how much damage their words could cause when it's spoken initially. This morning, I want to take a look at a topic that I've just titled The Destructive Force of a Rumor. The destructive force of a rumor. It is simply the next passage that we come to in our study of the book of Acts. It is in Acts 21. If you have your Bibles, you can turn there. Acts 21, verses 26 through 36. You know, sometimes we discover a rumor or false information and we can go deal with it and squash it. And sometimes that can happen. But you know, other times, a rumor gets out there, gossip gets out there, and it goes beyond what we ever anticipated and causes great damage. Here's our primary thought for the day. In spite of efforts to subdue it, a rumor that grows can become a destructive force. A rumor that grows can become a very destructive force. We see that happening in the book of Acts, chapter 21, verses 26 through 36. Let me give you some background on where we are. For those who have been walking along with us through the book of Acts, a lot of this you will remember. If you are a guest, hopefully this will help you catch up. Have you been walking along but you've missed a Sunday or two, hopefully this will also help you to catch up. The Apostle Paul is in his third missionary journey. He is on the last leg of that missionary journey. You may remember that one of the things he's doing on this journey is to take back an enormous offering that was given by the Gentile churches to go to the church in Jerusalem. And so Paul is heading back to the church in Jerusalem, which is right about here. This had been the third missionary journey. You'll see more about this later as well. He's now back in Jerusalem. He showed up at the church with his offering, not having seen those leaders for months or years, with a report on what was happening. Paul has with him a missionary team. By the way, one person in particular that will be of note is a guy named Trophimus. Just kind of file that away. We'll come back to that. Paul shows up in Jerusalem. The leadership sits down. He begins to tell them a report of Gentiles being saved, Gentiles being born again. Incredible reports, and they rejoice. And then James, the pastor of the church in Jerusalem, in turn says to Paul, he says, thousands of Jews have been converted in Jerusalem and are now followers of Jesus Christ. It's incredible, Paul. He said, but Paul, there's one problem. There is a rumor. We looked at this rumor last week. There is a rumor that has spread. This rumor is that you are trying to talk the Jews who get converted into not honoring Moses anymore, not being Jewish, and forsaking all their Jewish customs. The rumor, Paul, is you are promoting that kind of activity among the converted Jews. It was a false story. It was a rumor. And so the leaders of the church in Jerusalem had an idea. They said, Paul, in order to dispel this rumor among the converted Jews, the Jewish Christians in Jerusalem, thousands of them, by the way, in order to dispel the rumor, here's what we'll do. We have a group of guys who have taken a Nazirite vow, and we're going to have you take and help them fulfill their vow at the temple. You're going to pay the fees that they owe for that vow. We talked about that vow last week in a lot more detail. And so I'll just suffice it to say it's a final act of sacrifice and offering and a certain fee that's paid. And Paul's going to now go with these guys, help them fulfill their vow and pay their fees as an act of saying, no, I am still honoring Jewish customs. And a visible act. And we talked last week about how really Paul should not have to do that. Really, Paul is simply facing a rumor that wasn't true. And yet Paul was more concerned about the gospel and the church of Jesus Christ than he was his right to not have to do what he was asked to do. Sometimes we might say, well, I ought not have to go and talk to them. I'm not the one that started. Oftentimes we feel that our right to be right is more important than the spread of the gospel. Paul did not think so. Paul thought that the spread of the gospel was more important, the glory of God was more important, so he went with these guys, took them to the temple, and for 6 days, helped to fulfill the vows. That is about where our story begins today. It is in Paul's effort to show that he was still Jewish. It was in his effort to dispel the rumor that he was not trying to dissuade the converted Jews to stop following Moses or the Jewish ceremonies or the customs. It was in his effort to show, hey, I'm still Jewish, that the rumor began and became very destructive. And so as we look at this story beginning in verse 26, here we will be considering the tendencies that fuel a rumor's damage. The tendencies. This is not necessarily an exhaustive examination of how a rumor works, but it is one example of how sometimes there are tendencies at place in our lives, in our words, and the things we say that can fuel the rumor and fuel the damage that it causes. Picking up in verse 26. Then Paul took the men, and the next day, having been purified with them, entered the temple to announce the expiration of the days of purification. This was the ceremony I was just speaking about, at which time an offering should be made for each one of them. Now, when the 7 days were almost ended, everybody see that? When the 7 days were almost ended, verse 27. So he had been with them 5 or 6 days. The end of the 7 days was almost done. So for days, Paul had been honoring a Jewish custom. This is important. For days, Paul had been propagating and encouraging and emphasizing the importance of this Jewish custom out in public, out in the temple, so everybody would know. Again, verse 27. Now, when the 7 days were almost ended, the Jews from Asia. The Jews from Asia. The Asia to which it is referring is Asia Minor. Asia Minor is one of the areas where Paul did a lot of mission work and ministry. This is another one of those things. Set the Jews from Asia aside for just a moment. I know we've got a couple of things now I've said that about, but this story, you kind of have to unpack it. The Jews from Asia, they're an important group. Seeing him in the temple, stirred up the whole crowd and laid hands on him. Now, what in the world were these Jews from Asia? Probably, by the way, from around Ephesus. That was the area of Asia Minor to which Paul spent the most time. In fact, he spent almost 3 years in Ephesus, the longest he spent at any church. That's important to know. And so these Jews from Asia, who probably knew Paul, you say, how did he know Paul? I'm going to show you in just a minute. They began to work up the crowds. What did they do to work up the crowds? Verse 28, crying out, "Men of Israel, help!" How many of you know that oftentimes rumor and gossip is fueled by emotion and overreaction and not by fact? Oftentimes the degree to which someone is committed emotionally to the rumor is what fuels the rumor rather than if it's actually true or not. And can I say this too? You can gossip and still be saying the truth. The facts you're speaking could be accurate, it's just that they don't need to be said. That can be gossip and a rumor. In this case, we're looking at a rumor that's just flat out not true. Again, verse 28, crying out, "Men of Israel, help!" This is the man who teaches all men everywhere against the people, the law, and this place being the temple. Paul's been talking against the temple. Paul's been talking against the people, that is the Jewish people and the law. So that's bad enough. That's the first accusation. That Paul speaks against the temple. Paul speaks against the Jewish people. Paul speaks against the ceremonies. And let me add something. The Jews from Asia are probably Jews, but not Christians. I would say that most likely the Jewish Christians in Jerusalem had already had their concerns taken care of by Paul attempting to follow through in this ceremony with this group of guys. And so I'm going to suggest to you that the Jewish Christians in Jerusalem were already okay with Paul. I'm going to further say that these guys, these Jews from Asia, are Jews who are not Christians, they're unbelievers. And they've come all the way from Ephesus, probably knowing Paul, and their first accusation against him is that he teaches against the people, against the law, and against the temple. And the second, if the first accusation weren't bad enough, and it is, the second one is unforgivable. Here's the accusation, verse 28. And furthermore, he also brought Greeks or Gentiles into the temple and has defiled this holy place. Now, where did that come from? Paul had been in the temple with a group of Jews fulfilling a ceremony for 6 days. Where in the world did they come up with the idea that he's carrying Gentiles into the temple? I got to be honest with you, he wouldn't have made it 10 feet if he had been trying to carry a Gentile into the temple, let alone do it for 6 days. It's a dumb statement. It doesn't make sense. Where did they get it? Look at verse 29. For they had previously seen Trophimus. Remember Trophimus? I mentioned? If you go back to the book of Acts chapter 20, we won't turn there, but just listen. Earlier in the book of Acts, Paul's in Ephesus. In Acts chapter 20, Paul gets forced out of Ephesus after several years of ministry there. And I want to show you something because it's interesting. Let's bring that map back up, Jason, if you could. The route that a rumor can travel. Listen, folks, I'm going to say this, I'm going to come down here just to say it, and I'm going to go back up. You have no idea the extent that your gossip or rumor can travel to do destruction when it's first spoken. You have no idea. Watch this. So, Paul, in his third missionary journey, starts out here in Ephesus, right there. From Ephesus, a large uprising happens. In fact, the whole theater gets filled with people chanting against Paul. Paul just escapes out of Ephesus, and as a result, he heads up through the edge of Asia Minor. This is Macedonia. He comes down into Macedonia, hits Corinth again, collecting offerings from Berea and Thessalonica and Philippi, and then he comes back around eventually, and toward the end of his third missionary journey, he meets with the Ephesian elders right here in Miletus. He has Trophimus with him. Trophimus is from, guess where Trophimus is from? Ephesus. I heard it. Ephesus. Thank you, Robert. Trophimus is from Ephesus. So if these Jews from Asia who were from Ephesus, even if they didn't know Paul, they knew Trophimus, and Trophimus was a Gentile. So they leave Ephesus, the Jews from Asia. They leave Ephesus. They come all the way to Jerusalem for the celebration. They get to Jerusalem and they see Paul, who they had last seen in Ephesus. They were probably part of the group who helped force Paul out of Ephesus. And their rumor and their gossip traveled hundreds, thousands of miles and made it to Jerusalem while Paul was there. This, before the days of telegraph, telephone, television, internet, social media. If a rumor that's so destructive can travel thousands of miles back in that day, how much more a rumor today with access to social media, internet, FaceTime, Snapchat, all of it. And it all came about because of this. You ready? It all came about because of a personal assumption. It all came about because of a personal assumption. One of the tendencies of fueling a rumor is for people to speak and act based upon their personal assumption about someone or someone else or someone else's motives. I cannot tell you how many times I've talked to folks and they've said, well, so-and-so did it because of this. And I've asked the question, well, did so-and-so tell you that? Well, no, but I know that she did. No, that is a personal assumption. You can't possibly know what she or he was thinking. You barely know what you're thinking. One of the things that fuels a rumor is when we speak out of turn, making assumptions about what someone might or might not have thought or might not have said. We're on fourth-hand information and we're assuming about what someone did or didn't do. And we see it here. It's causing Paul and the gospel all kinds of trouble. To act on personal assumption is one of the tendencies of fueling a rumor. How many of you know that it was, at least in part, throughout the Scriptures, we see rumors, half-truths, gossip, cause God's people great trouble. I'm talking from the Old Testament on through. Half-truth is a full lie. Gossip, and sometimes it's gossip with true information. I think of the book of Job. Job was in a bad, bad way. And he had some friends who showed up, he thought to help him. And instead, they emotionally persecuted him. You know why? They kept telling Job Sir, there is no way you have this much trouble in your life if you have not sinned against God. There is no way you have this much trouble in your life if you have not had bad intentions toward God. They made a boatload of assumptions about him, and as a result began to speak those assumptions and caused him to be agonized over it. Now, I could go on and on with examples all through Scripture, but ladies and gentlemen, if you come to tell me something someone said or didn't say or something someone did or didn't do, and I ask you, well, did she tell you that? Did he tell you that? Did they tell you that? And even if they did tell you that, I'm probably going to say, yeah, but we don't need to discuss it without them here. But especially if we're going to make up things or we're going to say things we're convinced is true, but because we assume somebody else might have thought or didn't think this. Personal assumptions fuels a rumor. Look at verse 30. So then, all the city was disturbed now. Now you got all the Jews who are non-Christians upset. That's a lot of folks, by the way. Even though there were thousands of Jews who had been converted, there were a lot more who hadn't been. Verse 30, and the city was disturbed. The people ran together. Now here's what you've got. You've got a rumor was started. Now you've got emotion and anger and passion. And oh, listen, you don't need facts anymore. You don't need actual truth anymore. You've got enough emotion to drive this thing and fuel this rumor. Verse 30, and all the city was disturbed, and the people ran together, seized Paul, dragged him out of the temple, and immediately the doors were shut. If someone would have just stopped and said, guys, listen, does it make sense to you that Paul's going to spend the last 6 days fulfilling a Jewish vow, only to walk a Gentile into the temple? That's like Temple Judaism 101. You don't bring a Gentile into the temple. That's stupid. That will get you killed. Have you all ever thought, did anybody stop? You know, early in the book of Acts, there's a group of people who want to take the Christian leaders and deal with them, and a guy named Gamaliel stands up and he says, guys, let's stop for just a second. Let me ask you a question. If this is of God, then do you want to be against God? And if it's not, it'll die away. And he actually dealt with the situation with truth rather than emotion. But rumors are fueled by passion and anger. Verse 31. Now as they were seeking to kill him, news came to the commander of the garrison that all Jerusalem was in an uproar. And so you have a Roman presence there in Jerusalem. There are only two things the Roman government hated. You could pretty much live the way you wanted as long as you paid your taxes and didn't cause a fuss. If either one of those two things happened, taxes weren't paid or there was some kind of a disruption in the community, the Roman military was going to come to bear. And so now the folks in Jerusalem, they are so angry at Paul with no real reason, they are missing the fact that if they're not careful, Rome is going to send their armies in and crush them. Verse 32. He immediately, that is the commander, immediately took soldiers and centurions and ran down to them. And when they saw the commander and the soldiers, they stopped beating Paul. It's like, oh, it's like the only thing that could get their attention was the soldiers showing up with weapons. Verse 33. Then the commander came near and took him and commanded him to be bound with two, that is Paul, took Paul, commanded him to be bound with 2 chains, and he asked who he was and what he had done. Isn't that funny? The commander shows up, takes Paul and says, I don't even know who this guy is. He's getting beat in the middle of just outside the temple in the middle of the street. I don't even know who he is. By the way, there was a Roman presence on the edge of the Temple Mount. In fact, it was on the northwestern edge. Several years ago, when Ellison and I were able to go over to the Holy Land, at that time, tensions were so low, they actually allowed us up to the Temple Mount and right there beside it. Now, we had another group who went in 2015, and tensions were so high, I don't think they allowed you all to get up to the Temple Mount, did they? Yeah. Things had just changed. There was some terroristic activity, that kind of stuff. But when we were there, we got to go up to the Temple Mount. So I asked our leader, I said, can you tell me about where the Roman garrison would have been when they arrested Paul in Acts 21? And he showed me that, and I was able to see the area. That course, that building's not still there. But still the area where that Roman garrison would have been, right on the edge of the Temple Mount, where they kept a presence at the temple to keep things low-key. So this thing had gotten out of hand quickly. Stuff like this didn't happen with a Roman presence. It had gotten out of hand quickly. And the commander, he doesn't even know who Paul is. Verse 34. Some among the multitude cried one thing, and some another. So when he could not ascertain the truth because of the tumult, he commanded him to be taken into the barracks. The barracks, that's the place I was talking about, that Roman presence, that building on the edge of the Temple Mount. Grab him, get him inside, and let's figure out what's going on. A lot of the people involved in the uprising don't even know who Paul is. It is amazing what anger and emotion and passion can do in the face of fact. Can I suggest to you that another tendency to fuel a rumor is to aggravate through passion and anger? To aggravate through passion and anger. Oh, ladies and gentlemen, that our mouths would be used to vertically glorify God and to horizontally bless people. That our mouths would be used to vertically lift up the name of Jesus Christ and horizontally share Christ with the lost. That our mouths would be used according to James. It doesn't make sense that you've got salt water and fresh water coming out of the same spout, and yet it happens. We're singing praises to Jesus one day, the next day we may be propagating a rumor. Maybe not. But I'm saying, when passion and anger get involved, I'm going to suggest to you something strongly that you back up and don't say anything. And I'm speaking to myself. Rumors generally remain powerful as they are fueled by emotion and passion and anger. And if we can tell a rumor or gossip and get people driven by emotion, then logic and spiritual direction begins to dissipate and damage is done. Now look at verse 35. When he reached the stairs, he had to be carried by that is Paul, had to be carried by the soldiers because of the violence of the mob. Hopefully you can begin to imagine this. There was such violence. Half the people in the mob thought one thing, half thought the other. No, very few really even knew what was going on. It's just that they were caught up in the passion of the moment. They would have torn Paul apart if he had gotten down in that crowd. So the soldiers grabbed him. They carried him up into the barracks. Verse 36. For the multitude of the people followed after, crying out, "Away with him!" And there's all this pressure to do something. Here's what rumor does. It pressures us to do something, and that something is probably going to be a wrong action because it's fueled by a rumor. And one of the tendencies of a rumor that continues to move out and get bigger and larger is pressure and anxiety and someone thinking, we've got to do something. Sometimes it's just a person wanting others to be impressed with his or her knowledge of the information they have. You got to ask yourself a question. The stuff you're saying about somebody else and that person's not present, is it somehow glorifying God? Is it somehow blessing that person and helping them? Is it somehow ministering the gospel to the group you're with? You got to ask yourself a question, then why am I talking about this person? Why am I talking about this situation right now? What good is it doing? Rumors tend to be fueled. And they get fueled in such a way that it's almost like you don't really see the damage until it's done. This past couple of weeks, a number of our folks here at Green Acres, and there are others from other churches, have been involved in helping prepare a house for someone in need. And a lot of stuff had to get done, but one of the pieces of that intrigued me most was the root, Beth. The root, right? Yeah, right? There's this root that got under the driveway. It busted the whole driveway up. Literally had to take sledgehammers and bust the concrete off, carry the concrete off, and then dig the root out. The root had not only done damage to the driveway, Pastor Brian told me this morning that it had actually begun to do some damage to the edge of the house, and if left to go, would have probably damaged the whole foundation of the house as it continued to grow. And I thought about that root. I thought about the people, 25, 30, 35 years ago, just planted themselves a tree. It's a pretty tree. They just put that tree in the ground. We're going to have us a nice shade tree along the side of our yard. And that tree is going to grow up, and it's going to provide some shade. And that tree is going to help us to just look pretty in our front yard. It's so nice. And all those years, that tree had just grown and provided shade and pleasant opportunities for people. Who knows? Maybe somebody did a picnic under that tree at one point. But all the while, that root was growing. And all the while that everybody on the outside was involved in their activity around the tree, that root was destroying something that I look at and go, it's concrete. How can you break it? That root was getting stuck and hung and fastening itself to that concrete. And it reminds me a whole lot of gossip and rumors. While everybody on the outside is enjoying themselves, the book of Proverbs says it goes down like a tasty morsel, but it's really just bitter. As everybody on the outside is enjoying themselves, going, hey, have you heard about so-and-so? Yeah, well, I heard about it. I'll tell you why she did that, why he did that. And while the enjoyment of the conversation is happening, the root is destroying things spiritually underneath. I'm going to tell you, there's this pressure and anxiety of a rumor and of gossip that does great damage that you might not have ever seen. When I got saved, when I turned to Christ and was born again, I came to the knowledge and the understanding I'm giving my life to Christ. And if you're born again here today, you did the same. And I'm going to tell you, when you did that, you gave your mouth to Him. You gave your tongue to Him. You gave your mind to Him. And that minds that are owned by Jesus, mouths that are owned by Jesus, tongues that are owned by Jesus would be used to propagate a rumor. God help us that would ever happen. In spite of efforts to subdue it, a rumor that grows can become a very destructive force. We know that Christ came to earth, fully God and fully man, right? Listen to this. Christ came to earth, fully God and fully man. He came to earth knowing that He would be crucified and die on a cross, right? We know that He came to earth, lived a sinless life for 30 years, ministered for 3 years, and then was hung on a cross, died, buried, and rose again. According to God's prophecy, according to God's word, the prophecy had to be fulfilled by the death, burial, and resurrection of Jesus Christ, right? But is it not intriguing that the thing that ultimately caused the leadership to bring Jesus Christ to the cross was a rumor, false information? The leaders, the religious leaders at the time, kept saying, this Jesus, Pontius Pilate, this Jesus, he's a revolutionary. He wants to turn people against the Roman government. He says he'll tear the temple down. He said he tries to teach his people not to pay taxes. They said all these things about Jesus. And granted, Jesus was going to go to the cross to die for us. But is it not intriguing that it was a rumor that brought Him there? And if gossip could bring Jesus to the cross, in spite of the fact that I know He was going there one way or another, how much damage do you think using your mouth to propagate rumor and gossip, how much damage do you think it can do today? How much damage do you think your gossip on social media, your gossip on text messages, your gossip through emails, over the phone, if it did that damage in the New Testament area, how much more now with all kinds of contemporary technology to propagate it? This is a truth that is near and dear to my heart, because I believe rumor and gossip and things said about people that are, whether they're true or even they're half-truths, may be one of the most dangerous things toward the local church today, at least from within. I don't think the persecution that people might bring to bear on the outside is as dangerous as rumor and gossip and false speaking from within the church. And so today, as we come to the end of this message, here is what I would ask. Is it time to give your heart and life, your mouth, your mind to Jesus Christ? I would invite you to come today. Is it time for you to say, Lord, I'm asking you to help me use my mind and my mouth and my tongue and my words to glorify you and to help others. Lord, help me that I would not be a part of rumor. You got to be honest with you. You're in the middle of a group and there's a conversation going on. And it's so easy to begin to talk about somebody. And then someone throws in that and someone throws in this piece and someone throws in that. It's so easy. And it's so awkward to go, guys, I think we need to talk about something else, right? Oh, that's so awkward. But maybe some of you are in friendships or relationship where someone is talking, and you're asking God, Lord, give me the love and the gentleness, but yet the boldness to say, you know what, let's just talk about something else. And maybe the Lord's leading you just to pray about that. Maybe the Lord's leading you to be a part of this fellowship because the way the Word is taught you like, or the way the people are, or whatever the case is, you come. I'm going to pray, and we're going to stand and sing, and you respond as the Lord leads. Father, right now in Jesus' name, I'm asking you to help us obey you right now. You stand.